Have you ever stayed awake at night, replaying a conversation in your head? Not because someone yelled at you, not because they betrayed you, but because they didn't do what you thought they would. Maybe you remembered their birthday, spent hours helping them through a difficult time, listened to every problem they had. You were there, again, and again, and again. Then one day, you needed them, and suddenly, they were too busy, too tired, too distracted, or maybe they simply weren't there at all. That moment hurts, not because of what happened, but because of what it seems to mean. They don't care about me. I was never important to them. I would never have done that. The disappointment feels personal, almost like betrayal. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most disappointment doesn't actions. It begins long before that. It begins with an expectation, one you may not have even realized you had. Every relationship contains invisible agreements, silent promises, rules that exist only inside our own minds. If I support you, you'll support me. If I always answer your calls, you'll answer mine. If I remember what's important to you, you's important to me. These rules feel obvious, fair, even moral. But there's one problem. The other person never agreed to them. Psychologists sometimes describe this as an implicit expectation, an assumption that another person shares the same emotional rulebook that we do. We never say it out loud. We simply expect it. And when reality doesn't been telling ourselves, the emotional crash can be devastating. What's fascinating is that two people can experience the exact same situation and react completely differently. Imagine two friends. Both send a message to someone they care about. Hours pass. No reply. The first person immediately thinks, they're ignoring me. They don't respect me. They've changed. The second person thinks, they're probably busy. I'll hear from them later. Same event. Completely different emotional experience. Why? Because suffering isn't always created by reality. It's often created by the meaning we attach to reality. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus understood this over 2,000 years ago. He famously wrote, "It is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about them." Modern psychology has reached a surprisingly similar conclusion. Our emotions aren't behavior. They're produced by our interpretation of that behavior. In other words, it's not what happened. It's what we believed should have happened instead. That's why disappointment feels so personal. It isn't effort. It's the collapse of an expectation we quietly built over weeks, months, or even years. Most people spend their entire lives trying to control other people's behavior, trying to make them more thoughtful, more loyal, more appreciative. But what if we've been trying to control the wrong thing? What if peace doesn't begin when other people finally change? What if it begins when we stop expecting them to become a reflection of ourselves? That single idea may be one of the most liberating psychological shifts you'll ever experience. Because once you understand where disappointment truly comes from, you stop giving other people complete control over your emotional state. And that's where real freedom begins. But to understand why, we first need to examine something almost everyone does, without ever realizing it. We assume that other people think, feel, and love the same way we do. Here's the strange thing about human nature. We don't see people as they are. We see them through ourselves. Without realizing it, we assume that other people think the way we think, care the way we care, love the way we love. And that's where disappointment quietly begins. Imagine this. You're the type of person who always replies to messages. Not because you have to, but because you believe it's respectful. Now imagine someone leaves your message unanswered for 2 days. Immediately, your brain begins writing a story. They don't care. They're avoiding me. They're disrespecting me. But what if none of those things are true? What if they're simply different? Psychologists call this projection bias. It's our tendency to assume that other people share our values, our priorities, and our emotional habits. It's favorite shortcuts, because understanding another person's mind takes effort. Assuming they're just like us is much easier. There's another psychological phenomenon called the false consensus effect. People naturally overestimate how many others think the same way they do. If honesty is your highest value, you assume honesty is everyone else's highest value. If loyalty matters deeply to you, you unconsciously expect loyalty from everyone around you. If remembering birthdays feels important, you quietly expect others to remember yours. None of these expectations are spoken. They're invisible, but they're powerful, because every expectation creates a hidden standard. And every hidden standard creates the possibility of disappointment. Think about how often you've heard someone say, "I would never do that." First, it sounds like a judgment, but psychologically, it's actually a confession. What they're really saying is, "I expected you to behave the way I would." The problem is, you are not them, and they are not you. Every person carries a completely different emotional blueprint, different childhoods, different experiences, different fears, different priorities, different definitions of love. Some people express love through words, others through actions. Some people need constant communication. Others feel close without speaking for weeks. Neither approach is automatically wrong. They're simply different operating systems. Yet we spend years expecting everyone to run the same software. No wonder relationships become exhausting. One of the biggest causes of conflict isn't cruelty. It's mismatch. Two people can genuinely care about each other, while constantly disappointing one another, not because either person is bad, but because they're loving each other in completely different languages. This is why assumptions are so dangerous. Your brain fills in missing information using your own personality. Instead of asking, "What kind of person are they?" it asks, "What would I do?" And then it treats that answer as reality. That's why disappointment often feels so shocking. Not because reality changed, but because your prediction was wrong. In psychology, expectations work like mental simulations. Before anything even happens, your brain quietly imagines the future, predicts how people will respond, how conversations will go, how relationships should unfold. When reality matches the prediction, everything feels comfortable. But when reality breaks the prediction, your brain experiences it almost like an error message. That emotional discomfort is what we call disappointment. Notice something important. The pain isn't happening in the present moment. It's happening in the gap between reality and the future your mind secretly created. The larger that gap becomes, the greater the suffering feels. This explains something that confuses many people. Why can two siblings, raised by the same parents, experience completely different levels of disappointment? Because expectations aren't objective. They're personal. One sibling expected emotional support. The other never expected it. Same parents, different expectations, different emotional outcomes. Once you begin seeing expectations this way, relationships start making much more sense. People aren't constantly breaking promises. More often, they're simply failing to fulfill promises that only existed inside our own imagination. And that realization, while uncomfortable, can also become incredibly freeing. Because the moment you stop assuming that everyone should think like you finally become curious about who they actually are. Instead of asking, "Why aren't they acting like me?" you begin asking, "What kind of person are they really?" That single shift changes everything. Because understanding people always creates more peace than trying to remake them into yourself. There's another reason disappointment hurts so much. One that's almost invisible. Imagine signing a contract with someone without ever showing it to them. The contract says, "I'll always be there for you. And in return, you'll always be there for me." It sounds fair, balanced, even loving. But there's one problem. The other person never signed it. They never even knew it existed. Yet somewhere deep inside, you've already accepted it as real. This is how many relationships quietly operate. Not through spoken agreements, but through invisible contracts. We create them with friends, with family, with romantic partners, even with coworkers. Every favor we give, every sacrifice we make, every late-night conversation, every time we choose someone else's needs over our own, our mind begins keeping score. Not consciously. Most of the time, we dance happening, but the brain remembers. Psychologists refer to this as the norm of reciprocity. It's one of the oldest social rules in human history. When someone gives us something, we naturally feel an urge to give something back. Without reciprocity, cooperation wouldn't exist. Communities wouldn't survive. Trust wouldn't develop. In many ways, it's one of the foundations of civilization. But here's where things become complicated. Reciprocity is a tendency, not a guarantee. Some people naturally return kindness. Others don't. Some people express gratitude openly. Others assume your kindness was simply part of who you are. Neither response changes what you expected, but it changes how much pain you feel. Think about a friendship. You're always the one making plans, checking in, remembering birthdays, offering help. After months or years, you suddenly stop reaching out, and something surprising happens. The friendship disappears. First, it feels like proof that they never cared. But is that always true? Or were both of you simply playing different roles? Without ever discussing them? Perhaps they assumed you enjoyed organizing everything. Perhaps they believed your silence meant you wanted space. Perhaps they genuinely never noticed the imbalance. People are selfish. Sometimes, they disappoint us because they never knew the expectations we quietly carried. That's what makes invisible contracts so dangerous. They create obligations without communication. And when those obligations aren't fulfilled, we interpret the absence of action as the absence of love. But love and expectation are not the same thing. In fact, expectation often disguises itself as love. Listen carefully to thoughts like these. If they loved me, they would know. If they cared, I wouldn't have to ask. If I matter, they should already understand. These sentences sound romantic, but psychologically, they're impossible standards, because no one can consistently meet expectations that were never spoken aloud. Even healthy relationships struggle under that kind of pressure. The tragedy is that both people may genuinely care about each other, while silently believing they're being misunderstood. One person thinks, I've given everything. The other thinks, I didn't know anything was wrong. Neither person intended to hurt the other, yet both leave feeling disappointed. This is why emotionally mature people communicate differently. Instead of assuming, they clarify. Instead of expecting, they express. Instead of keeping silent, they become curious. Not because they demand more from people, but because they understand that minds cannot read minds. One conversation can prevent months of resentment. One honest sentence can replace hundreds of silent assumptions. Invisible contracts lose their power the moment they're brought into the light. And once you understand that, something remarkable begins to happen. You stop measuring love by how accurately someone guesses your unspoken expectations. Instead, you begin seeing people for who they actually are, not for who you secretly hoped they would become. So, does this mean you should stop caring about people? Not at all. One of the biggest misunderstandings about emotional freedom is the belief that it requires emotional distance. People hear the phrase expect nothing, and they imagine becoming cold, detached, unfeeling. But that's not what emotional maturity looks like. Emotional maturity isn't loving people less. It's expecting less from what you cannot control. There's an important difference. You can still be generous, still be kind, still love deeply, still give your time, still support the people who matter to you. The difference is, you stop attaching your peace to how they respond. Think of the sun. It rises every morning. It gives warmth without asking who deserves it. It doesn't shine only for those who appreciate it. It simply shines because that's its nature. Emotionally healthy people begin living the same way. They help because helping reflects their character. They forgive because forgiveness protects their peace. They care because compassion is part of who they are, not because they're secretly negotiating for something in return. The moment your kindness becomes a transaction, it also becomes a source of suffering. Every delayed reply becomes rejection. Every forgotten birthday becomes betrayal. Every unanswered favor becomes proof that you cared more than they did. But when kindness becomes an expression of your values, instead of an investment expecting returns, something remarkable happens. Disappointment begins losing its power, not because people suddenly become better, but because your emotional well-being is no longer dependent on their behavior. Psychologists call this an internal locus of control. It's actions. You can always control your response. And that realization changes relationships forever. Because once you stop trying to manage other people's behavior, you finally have enough energy to manage your own mind. Ironically, this often improves relationships. People feel less pressure around you. Conversations become more honest. Resentment slowly disappears. You stop testing people. Stop keeping score. Stop waiting for them to prove their love. and instead, you simply observe who they consistently choose to be. Some people will naturally meet you with kindness. Others won't. Some relationships will grow stronger. Others will quietly fade away. And for the first time, you'll allow that to happen without forcing the outcome. Because peace isn't created by making everyone love you. It's created by no longer needing everyone to. There's a quote often attributed to the Buddha. Attachment is the root of suffering. Whether or not those exact words were ever spoken, the psychological truth remains powerful. The tighter we grip our expectations, the more pain we experience when reality moves in another direction. But the moment we loosen that grip, we also loosen suffering. Imagine waking up tomorrow without silently expecting people to think exactly like you, without assuming they'll respond exactly when you want, without believing they owe you because you once gave them something. How much lighter would life feel? How many arguments would never happen? How much resentment would quietly disappear? Perhaps freedom isn't found in changing people. Perhaps freedom begins when you stop asking them to become a reflection of yourself. The people who experience the deepest peace aren't the ones surrounded by perfect relationships. They simply understand something most of us learn far too late. Expectation is often the distance between gratitude and disappointment. Lower the expectation, and gratitude has room to grow. Raise the expectation, and even kindness begins to feel insufficient. So the next time someone disappoints you, pause before asking, "Why did they do this to me?" Instead, ask yourself, "What expectation did I create?" Without ever sharing it. That single question has the power to transform every relationship you'll ever have. If this video resonated with you, tell us in the comments what finally decided to let go of. If you enjoy psychology, emotional intelligence, and understanding the hidden patterns that shape human behavior, subscribe to True Persona. Until next time, protect your peace, not by changing other people, but by changing what you expect from them.